Let's take a look at the grid in CSS. To create a grid, we'll first of all create some divs in HTML. The first div is the parent element and has the class of container, and every other div will have a class of item.1, item.2, item.3, item.4, item.5, and item.6. So we basically have 6 items inside of one container. Now we create a selector for our container, and we create a selector for every single item and give every single item a background color. So as you can see, we now have 6 containers. Every container has the same width and the same height, and everyone has a different background color. Now, to use a grid, we can use display grid. And as you can see, nothing is going to change. And the reason is that for a grid, we need some additional setup. We need to define the amount and the width of the columns, and we need to define the amount and the height of the rows. And in order to do so, we can use grid template columns and grid template rows. So by using grid template columns, we define the amount of rows we'll have. So you can either use pixels or fractions. So let's start by using pixels. So let's say we have 2 columns, for example. The first column has a width of 200 pixels, for example, and the second one has a width of 200 pixels, for example. And as you can see, we already have our columns right now. So 2 columns, this is the first column, 200 pixels, and this is the second column, 200 pixels. Now let's do the same for our rows by using grid template rows. And let's say the first row has a height of 400 pixels and the second one has a height of 300 pixels, for example. And as you can see, we now have a gap between our rows. So first row 400 pixels, second row 300 pixels, and since we have a third row here, we should probably create a third one, 200 pixels. So now we have enough space for our 6 items. If I'm going to remove the width and the height for each box and save the document, you can see that each of these items now takes up all of the available space of the columns and the rows, so basically of the grid. And now it's really good to visualize. We have 2 columns. Each of these columns has a width of 200 pixels, and we have 3 rows. The first row has a height of 400 pixels, the second row has a height of 300 pixels, and the third row has a height of 200 pixels. Instead of pixels, we could also use fractions though. And fractions basically just means you have a certain amount of space inside of this container. We could, for example, say that we want to have a width of 100% of the viewport width, and we can have a height of 100% of the viewport height, which actually means that this is the width and this is the height. So everything is the width and everything is the height. So the entire window is width and height basically. And now we can basically say that we want to divide this available space and use that available space to basically create our grid. So we could, for example, say that we want the first column to take 1 fraction of the available space, while the second column, for example, should take 2 fractions of the available space. And once we save, you can basically see that the first column takes up 1 fraction and the second column takes up 2 fractions of all of the available space, so basically of the entire viewport width. So let's take a look at the grid template rows. We can do the same here. Let's say the first row should take up 1 fraction of the available space, the second row should take up 3 fractions of the available space, and the fourth row should take up probably 1 fraction of the available space. So as you can see, first row 1 fraction, second row 3 fractions, third row 1 fraction. And everything works as expected. You can also create a gap by using the gap property. So we can, for example, say that we want a gap of 10 pixels in between the items. And now it looks like that. And imagine you would have photos right here. This could be a perfect photo grid, for example. This could be a photo, this could be a photo, this could be a photo, and so on. Now, for every individual item, we could actually define how many columns and how many rows that item should take up. So basically how much space it should cover. So we could, for example, say that we want to have a third column, for example, that takes up 1 fraction. And now our grid has some available space at the bottom. So let's say I want our first item to take up the space from here to here, basically. So basically from spot 1, 2 to 3. You basically got to divide this into a regular table, if you want to say so. And then you can really imagine what the lines look like. So this is basically point 1. This is point 2, this is point 3, and this is point 4. And if you go from top to bottom, this is point 1, this is point 2, this is point 3, and this is point 4. So you have point 1 to 4. And now you can go into the item and define for every single item how much space it should basically fill. And you can do so by defining grid columns, for example. And now we could say we want to start at position 1 for the first item. And we want to go up to position 2, 3. So we want to go from 1 to 3. And you can do so and indicate so by using the slash, for example. So let's say our second item is just fine, but now we want our third item, so the green container, basically to take up the space from, let's say, 1 to 2 to 3. So we just use grid columns again, and we say 1/3, and it will take up all of the space. So let's say we want to have item 4, so the purple one basically, to take up the space from here to here. So we can go here, and now we need to define rows basically, because it should take up everything from row 1, 2, 3, 4, from 2 to 4. So we go ahead and use grid rows, and we say we want to go from row 2 to 4. As you can see, it's now displaying only the purple one and not the other ones anymore. And we can change that by using grid column, and we want to start at position 1, 2, 3 to 4. So we want to go from 3 to 4. And as you can see, we have our layout again. Now there would be a second option to do the same, or to achieve the same. So let's just delete all of these things, and we have our base layout again. So let's say we want this item to take up basically 2 columns. So basically we want to go from here, 1, 2 to the right. And we can do so by using grid columns, so the same property basically, but we can use a different syntax. We can say span 2. So you want this to span over the amount of 2 columns, if you want to say so. So we basically start here and span for 1 and span for 2. And once we save, we have the same result. And obviously the same also works for rows. So let's just say we want the green one to take up 2 rows, for example. And we can do so by going to the green one and say grid row span. We are going from 0, 1, 2. So we want to span over 2 rows again. And once we save, we basically have the expected result. And this is all you need to know about creating grids in HTML and CSS.